Salutations, respected viewers. The motion before the House is this House believes that Tony Blair is a war criminal. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, Tony Blair is a war criminal because Blair strove at all costs to avoid peace. He did everything he possibly could to get into every war he could. This is a crime against peace as defined at the Nuremberg International Criminal Tribunal of 1946. We could talk about Iraq, we could talk about Sierra Leone, we could talk about the bombing of Yugoslavia. But all of it comes back to Tony Blair's outright dishonesty and casuistry. The best witness against Blair is Blair. Read his autobiography, A Journey, he calls it. It was a journey to the grave for tens of thousands. And in it he says, sometimes we stretch the truth past breaking point. So in his own words, he was an inveterate liar. So what is the word that's going to be etched on his gravestone? Iraq. It's a four-letter word, all about weapons of mass destruction. And various intelligence agencies cast grave doubt that there were these weapons of mass destruction. He was warned about this. He strove to get a UN Security Council resolution authorizing a ground war. He didn't get it. He went ahead anyway. But the very fact that he tried to secure this indicates that he realized that it was legally necessary. And regime change, he often talked about the monstrous atrocities of the Saddam Hussein regime, and all that's true. But as Blair's only Attorney General warned him, grossly abusive actions by a government are not sufficient legal grounds for military action. So you may point out that the UN Security Council had issued an earlier resolution saying there'd be serious consequences if there wasn't fulsome Iraqi cooperation with weapons inspectors, but it said serious consequences. That does not mean war in diplomatese. So he had no plan for when he occupied Iraq. He didn't desertify tanks. He didn't buy armoured Land Rovers for his military. So while still wasting so much money on vanity projects. So there were obviously many Iraqis, civilians and military personnel who were killed by him, but he didn't look after his own troops. If he was going to have this discretionary war, the very least he could do was adequately equip his soldiers. So there was an awful lot that was wrong with Saddam Hussein's Iraq, but ISIS wasn't there, Al-Qaeda weren't there. It soon became a magnet for Al-Qaeda and its ilk. So we could go back to Yugoslavia, 1991. Kosovo was Yugoslav sovereign legal territory. There's an uprising. The Yugoslavs attempted to quell it, as they're absolutely entitled to under international law. And then without a UN resolution, the United Kingdom and other NATO countries, they bombed Yugoslavia, killing hundreds of civilians in the process, deliberately targeting a television station and killing journalists. That was, by not any stretch of the imagination, a military target. So it was flagrantly illegal. To deliberately kill someone illegally is murder by any definition. A court in Malaysia already found Blair guilty of crimes against humanity. He has no answer. He led the country to war on a lie. He knew precisely what he was doing. Countless warnings were given. At any point, he could have pulled back. He could have kept the United Kingdom neutral. He would have been so much more popular, and tens of thousands of lives would have been saved. All right, the Americans would have gone ahead anyway, but certainly hundreds of British servicemen and servicewomen would not have been killed. Anyway, so let me go over again why Tony Blair is a war criminal, and it's partly to do with the abusive actions of British soldiers in Iraq, the murder of Bashir Musa, where he was beaten to death by several soldiers over several hours. An absolutely ghastly and sadistic crime, and it just typified the villainy of certain members of the British Armed Forces. Because Tony Blair started wars of aggression. Tony Blair's troops committed crimes against civilians. Blair did not adequately arm the armed forces, and Blair deliberately targets civilians. And for those reasons, it is an open and shut case, I beg to propose. Right, so I shall now be the opposition. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, Tony Blair is not a war criminal, did not start wars of aggression, and did not authorize any attacks upon civilians. So Blair wanted peace. As he said in the run-up to the liberation of Iraq, that the only way to achieve peace was to show readiness for war. There were dozens of UN Security Council resolutions against Iraq. That last one in February 2003 warned of serious consequences. There were already air raids going on against Iraq for 12 years. What could be more serious than bombing raids? It could only be a ground invasion. The tortured millions of Iraq were pleading with foreign troops to emancipate them, and they knew they didn't have the strength to overthrow their vicious tyrant. Saddam Hussein was easily the most malicious lunatic on earth, and it was absolutely obscene to say that people in Iraq should suffer under him without end. The Iraqi exile groups who wanted to free their homeland, their flag was going forward too. So we know that the Saddam Hussein regime had played cat and mouse with the weapons inspectors since 1991. We know that Iraq had all these weapons of mass destruction. Various countries had said they'd sold them. The Iraqis had declared them in 1991. The ceasefire in 1991 was predicated on Iraq destroying its weapons of mass destruction in a verifiable fashion. The onus was upon Baghdad to prove that they had rid themselves of the weapons of mass destruction. And if they did not prove it, then the assumption had to be it was still there. Why else would one not prove it? Because then it made other countries think that they still had these weapons of mass destruction. So they were not letting scientists be interviewed in person. Obviously, any government scientist interviewed by the weapons inspectors was worried he'd be tortured to death by Saddam's secret police when he got back if he divulged anything. There were sanctions against Iraq for years. Those sanctions were lifted, and people often lay the consequences of the sanctions at the door of Blair and others. These were UN sanctions, right? They were not just British sanctions. Many, many countries agreed to them. There's no question they were legal. There was the Oil for Food program. Iraq was allowed to sell a certain amount of oil and use that money only to buy food and medicine. Saddam Hussein deliberately starved his people to death. Saddam Hussein deliberately withheld medicine from his people because he wanted to see them die shrieking in agony. And some people have the temerity to blame that on Blair. Blair and others, they freed Iraq. They ended this monstrous suffering. And it is true that Ba'athists, Saddam Hussein's acolytes, they continued their reign of terror after 2003. All of that is on the head of Saddam Hussein and some Al-Qaeda elements. And it's not true to say there was no one like Al-Qaeda in Iraq beforehand. Abu Nidal was there. Saddam Hussein was bankrolling suicide bombing against Israel and elsewhere. Whilst he sometimes posed as a secular leader, he would also appeal to religious reactionary mania as well, putting as religious slogan on the flag and so forth. So some weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq after 2003. Not very much, but it doesn't matter. Even if it was just one vial of a poison gas, that still proves the point. There were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. There were missiles beyond the permitted range and so forth. So there's no question there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. No, not as much as might have been expected, but it doesn't matter. The principle has been proven. There was an attack on American troops in Iraq days before the liberation commenced on the 19th of March 2003. Even with forces massing in his border, Saddam Hussein would not cooperate. He was given a last chance by George W. Bush for him and both his sons to leave the country. They refused to do so. So why on earth were they refusing to cooperate with weapons inspectors? One had to assume because they had something to hide. Now, no war is perfect. Resources are limited, so sometimes troops get killed. Blair never asked anyone to abuse any civilian, and indeed the British Army prosecuted those against whom there were credible allegations of murder, such as in the case of Bashir Musa. And what else? The United Kingdom never authorised waterboarding or anything of that nature, wouldn't allow suspected terrorists to be hooded in Iraq, which the Americans were doing. So the UK's ethical standards are much higher than anybody else's in this conflict. As for the bombing of Yugoslavia, well, there doesn't need to be this UN Security Council resolution. It was judged to be legitimate by the UN Secretary General at the time. Otherwise, these issues never get decided. So Blair did this with the highest possible motives. There was no particular advantage accruing to the United Kingdom. It was doing this in an unselfish way in consonance with the most estimable principles of human rights and to ensure the peace and security of the world. And for those reasons, I beg to oppose.